So it's been 100 days since President Lee Jae Myung took office following a snap election in June. For more on this, we're joined today by Professor Hans Schattle, Professor of Political Science at Yonsei University. Professor Schattle, thanks for joining us this morning.
Thank you for having me, Angie. Good morning to you.
Morning. So we will be hearing from the president soon in his press conference, and it's been quite a busy first 100 days, from his summit with President Trump to taking down loudspeakers near the border and handing out consumer vouchers. What would you say are the biggest takeaways so far?
Well, certainly what I think people will remember most about these 100 days looking back will be the crisis, first of all, of this past week. Of course, that was unexpected, I think, but it certainly will be the dominant challenge that President Lee Jae Myung has had to deal with, trying to figure out a way to agreeably bring home these hundreds of South Korean nationals that were detained in Georgia, and also tried to work out an agreement with the U.S. to figure out how to go forward with Korea's pledges to continue to invest in the U.S. economy at this difficult time. I think the second biggest challenge that the president had, which is very much related to this, was working out the trade agreement with the United States over the summer. I mean, keep in mind that the U.S. and South Korea had a free trade agreement going back over a decade before the second Trump presidency began, and the timing that President Lee had to deal with was the U.S. side basically pulling back on that free trade agreement and having to renegotiate. So like many other U.S. allies around the world, President Lee Jae Myung has been put in the position of having to spend a lot of his time right now, for him, his first 100 days, basically trying to first come up with a series of trade measures that would try to curtail the damage of essentially losing many of the benefits that went with that free trade agreement. So, of course, South Korean exports now have, many of them now have this 15% tariff. And, there could have been a lot more in terms of tariffs imposed on South Korea. So in a sense, it was about containing damage from that. And more recently, it's been about trying to contain the damage from this immigration raid this past week. So not an easy run for the first 100 days, I think.
Absolutely, a lot of issues to tackle. And the first 100 days usually give us a pretty good idea of where the new government is headed. How do you think this administration stands apart from previous governments? And what is your overall assessment of his performance so far?
Sure, Angie. Well, turning to more mundane matters in domestic politics, I think President Lee made very key statements when he first took office that this would be the government of democracy promotion following what happened with the previous Yoon administration, the way that hit the rocks with the martial law decree and so forth. It's too early to tell, I suppose, long term, how democracy promotion will carry out in this administration, whether we'll see some kinds of innovations over the next few years that would bring the public closer to democratic decision-making. I think a lot of these issues are emerging, but they've been somewhat on the back burner, I think, since foreign policy has been such a driving issue so far in this presidency. Another key issue, of course, was just simply improving the well-being, the welfare, and the opportunities for everyday working people and small businesses. And I think the vouchers, which you mentioned earlier, in which small businesses could essentially be magnets of consumer traffic over this summer, I think that helped. And I think symbolically that sent a message that this government was not just out for the big corporations, but for the mom and pop shops that often find it hard hold their own in the economic conditions that we're in. And then with diplomacy, I think before President Lee was elected, there were a lot of questions as to whether he would tilt the country closer to China, perhaps even toward diplomacy with North Korea, and whether that would possibly create some distance or even tension with regard to the U.S. and even Japan. But on the contrary, over the past few months, first of all, President Lee has shown that diplomacy with Japan is still a top priority, and I think he's trying to put the country also. The question is whether he can maintain that diplomacy with Japan while also trying to basically get some measures from Japan that would suggest a more complete and multi-sided reconciliation process rather than South Korea making concessions to Japan. I think he's taking that direction. It's very interesting that he had the summit with the Japanese prime minister at the time before going to Washington. So pragmatism has been very much an order of the day for this president.
Right, and looking ahead, what might be some of the main things he will need to focus on for the remainder of his term?
Well, there are some big issues that any president, I think, right now in this country in the in the 2020s really needs to focus on. And they're the big issues that the public worries about, but yet it seems no president over the past several years is able to resolve it, making housing more affordable, figuring out how to reform education in a way that more young people will be able to avoid burnout and find paths that will encourage them to prosper and stay here, and find career paths at a time when jobs for young adults are diminishing. And also related to this, at a time when now the country is investing a lot of money in the US and a lot of other economies abroad. Of course, that's always money that could otherwise be spent creating jobs domestically. So trying to figure out how to create more jobs for the country's young adults at a time when overseas investment is increasing. This is something that I've heard a lot of everyday people talking about when I've had conversations here in Seoul. I think my students often worry about it as well, yet it's not necessarily an issue that's at the front burner. So simply improving people's opportunities and quality of life and giving them more voice in the political process. All the younger generation's key concerns that are important issues that often presidents have to put back on the back burner. Can this president put it on the front burner?
Right, absolutely. All right, Professor Schattle, I'm afraid that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for your insight. We appreciate it.
Thanks so much, NG. Take care.